Welcome to Memo to File. As part of our series of digests with early career professionals, we're joined by Barrister Eimear Dooley to consider our recent interview with Pat Byrne about the Criminal Assets Bureau. Eimear was called to the bar in 2022 and has a wide practice as a junior counsel, including in criminal law. She also holds a BA in law from the University of Cambridge and an LLM from Trinity College Dublin. We began by considering the key takeaways from the episode on CAB.
It was strange to hear of it as such kind of reactive legislation. I'd never really encountered legislation that occurred so. Usually, there's kind of a slower build up in my kind of limited experience. Usually, there's a slower build up to political matters kind of happen incrementally, but this was, I mean, obviously a needed reaction as well. I mean, I'm not saying it's a unnecessary piece of legislation. I mean, I do think it was a deeply necessary piece of legislation, but yeah, it's strange it being tied so directly to a specific event in history.
Yeah, and there's an element too with, I suppose, legislation a lot of the time that it can take so much time to get through that once it's implemented and signed or whatever way you want to look at it, that amendments can be kind of few and far between, that it can be challenging if you implement a whole body of legislation and then you're trying to tweak it afterwards, that sometimes an expedited process could lead to that undesirable situation in some respects.
Sure. And desirable and undesirable, like I do think there's also room. I mean, we have a cooperative process between the legislation and, judicial progress. And I do think the proceeds of crime legislation is a good example of ways in which the courts have, and I think it is kind of written into the way the proceeds of crime legislation is that there are opportunities for the courts to kind of put their own safeguards on it or to say like read into it practical matters that allow it to work as well. So it's both good and bad legislation that is kind of sparse initially because it does allow for it to kind of move and grow. And I do think the Proceeds of Crime Act, the fact that it still works today and it's being used, to great effect today is a testament to it as well.
Do you think nowadays, given how quick that legislative process was, or efficient to put it that way, whether those kind of conditions exist today, if the likes of CAB was being pushed forward now?
Well, I mean, there's always crime and there's always criminal assets. So I think, I mean, certainly, I don't think our criminal landscape has gotten any less eventful. For sure, I think that there would still be, if there was no proceeds of crime legislation today, I think there would be a huge need for proceeds of crime legislation. Um, I'd say the only difference maybe would be that perhaps legislation introduced today would have more, like obviously the process crime legislation has had to develop and kind of respond to the development of crime. And probably if it had an opportunity to come in today, it would be able to address things like extraterritorial assets on the face of it, as opposed to that kind of being developed through the case law. But I certainly think if we didn't have it today, we would be crying out for it today.
In relation to, let's say, your expertise or the criminal bar more generally, are there any parts of the interview that might inform the approach of a junior counsel or junior lawyer in this sphere?
Was something that you really need to be aware of, because I think a lot of what tends to happen is the bureau will initiate a case and the respondent will instruct usually their like a criminal solicitor or a solicitor who would have more familiarity with the area of the criminal law. And the really really important distinction with the legislation is that it operates in rem, like it operates as against the asset as opposed to against the person. And I mean, it sounds like a simple distinction, but it's really like right off the bat you have to get your head around that, because you can kind of otherwise, and I know like certainly, I mean, I've definitely been guilty of it myself. You kind of go in defending a person like you're in, like you're in the criminal courts of justice, and that's not what's happening. What's happening is a seizure order is being sought over property. So you have to kind of completely refocus your brain.
It is a very interesting distinction. And would you be able to go a bit deeper on kind of how that sort of materially affects the approach?
Sure. Yeah, well, it's been I mean, it's a piece of legislation that has been subject to certainly in the early days there were From what I read, and again, like I wasn't practicing at this juncture, but there were initially constitutional challenges mounted against the legislation in terms of its impact on the person. And all of these challenges were defeated in the Supreme Court. And they were defeated on the basis that the legislation operates in rem. So the the kind of the rights that were being invoked were not, they weren't applicable because this was what was being sought was orders against the property. But in terms of how you orientate your case, you have to be aware that although something might seem on the face of it to be invoking, say, certain rights or certain kind of things that would be very relevant if you're conducting a criminal trial or a criminal defense, they might not be as relevant as you initially think. And it might be important not to put your eggs all in that basket. Like you do need to focus on the provenance of the property as well, because that really is ultimately what it's about. It's a concept that we did kind of learn from other jurisdictions from, and the way it's because what it allows is basically for these disposal orders to be sought while a matter is ongoing, or in circumstances where, like, criminal matters aren't fully concluded. And it's, for me, what I see with the Proceeds of Crime Act is it's very much a piece of legislation that operates on a very practical basis. It's trying to solve, a problem that perhaps it requires a certain amount of kind of legal reconfiguring.
And what's the importance, the significance, let's say, of let's say CAB being a designated agency to carry that out, rather than it could be folded into an agency such as, let's say, on Garda Síochána, whereas CAB very much brought all the relevant agencies together to pursue that aim.
But I think it is a common sense approach. It's, I mean, one thing, and this is a very simple way to put it, but I mean, on Garda Síochána are very, very busy. As well as that, so it kind of builds in some of those powers and some of the revenue commissioner's powers, also an incredibly busy state body, and it allows the bureau's pure focus to be on civil forfeiture. Whereas, say, on Garda Síochána, if they're dealing with something, and this is all, again, I'm sure members of An Garda Síochána would be able to speak much better on this. But if they're focusing on something, they're focusing probably primarily, I would guess, on the criminal prosecution. The fact that the Bureau kind of stands alone but has these powers, it allows the Bureau then, I think, to focus purely on the assets and to operate kind of independently of a criminal prosecution. And it also allows, I mean, on a common sense basis, it allows for assets that maybe aren't being held by, the person who was the provenance of the criminal activity that obtained the assets. Like, you can have criminal assets bureau cases being brought against someone who has no association with crime, who's wound up with these assets for whatever reason. And so it is, I mean, it's for me, it seems like a very kind of common sense approach. And then again, to allow them access to revenue powers and to allow revenue officers to work within it. Again, like you do need, if you're going to start talking about the provenance of property, you do need insight into tax affairs. And so again, just all, it makes sense, I think, for what their job is.
And that concludes this digest of the Memo to File episode on the Criminal Assets Bureau. Thanks to Barrister Eimear Dooley for speaking with us, and thank you as always for listening. We would love to hear from you, so please do send us an email at memotofilepodcast@gmail.com. Stay well until next time.